Hi everyone, my name is Matheus Alcântara Nunes, and my oral presentation is about the article, The Psychology of Prejudice, In-Group Love or Out-Group Hate, written by Brewer. This article explains prejudice through the relations between in-groups and out-groups. In-group would be our own group, like our family, our religion, or our culture. Out-group would be the other group, different from us. So, what is prejudice? According to Gordon Allport, he defines prejudice as a hostile attitude or feeling toward a person solely because he or she belongs to a group to which one has assigned objectionable qualities. It may be felt or expressed, and it is directed toward a group as a whole or toward an individual because he or she is a member of that group. Also, prejudice is a judgment that resists facts and ignores truth and honesty. It is based on faulty and inflexible generalization or stereotyping. Most contemporary research on intergroup relations, prejudice, and discrimination appears to accept, at least implicitly, the idea that in-group favoritism and out-group negativity are reciprocally related. Sonner believed that these positive sentiments toward the in-group were directly correlated with contempt, hatred, and hostility toward out-groups. However, Allport postulated that in-groups are psychologically primary in the sense that familiarity, attachment, and preference for one's in-groups come prior to development of attitudes toward specific out-groups. Further, Allport recognized that preferential positivity toward in-groups does not necessarily imply negativity or hostility toward out-groups. Therefore, in this article, Brewer reassessed the validity of this presumption, arguing that in-group favoritism and out-group prejudice are separable phenomena and that the origin of identification and attachment to in-groups is independent of intergroup conflict. So, is negative reciprocity inevitable? Well, for Sonner, the proposition derived from his structural functional theory of the origins of groups in context of conflict over scarce natural resources. In an environment of scarcity, individuals needed to band together in groups to compete successfully with other groups for survival. However, according to Brewer, discrimination can be motivated solely by outgroup antagonism in the absence of any in-group loyalty or attachment. Brewer argues that prejudice, hostility, or hatred of a particular social group in the absence of any in-group identification or benefit is not a case of intergroup behavior at all. Instead, it is an individual attitude parallel to antagonisms or phobias with respect to any social object. This is not to deny the pervasiveness and significance of outgroup hate as a social problem. Indeed, many of the more virulent forms of prejudice and racism most likely represent outgroup hostility rather than in-group favoritism. In this section, the author explains that since in-group-outgroup distinctions do not always involve intense competition or conflict over scarce resources, there is need for a theory of the evolution of social groups that does not depend on intergroup conflict to explain the nature of prejudice against outgroups. This theory starts from the recognition that group living represents the fundamental survival strategy that characterizes the human species. For long-term survival, we must share resources. The decision to cooperate is a dilemma of trust since the ultimate benefits depend on everyone else's willingness to do the same. Social differentiation, like symbols and behaviors, and clear group boundaries provide one mechanism for achieving the benefits of cooperative interdependence without the risk of excessive costs. By limiting aid to mutually acknowledged in-group members, total costs and risks of non-reciprocation can be contained. Thus, in-groups can be defined as bounded communities of mutual trust and obligation that delimit mutual interdependence and cooperation. Thereby, group identification is the product of opposing needs for inclusion and differentiation from others. Discrimination between in-group and out-groups is a matter of relative favoritism toward the in-group and the absence of equivalent favoritism toward out-groups. Nonetheless, there are a number of ways in which the effects of social differentiation provide a fertile ground for conflict and hate. Brewer considers a few ways in which the conditions of maintaining in-group integrity and loyalty pave the way to outgroup hate and hostility, which are moral superiority, perceived threat, common goals, common values and social comparison, and power politics. Ultimately, studies suggest that many forms of discrimination and bias may develop not because outgroups are hated, but because positive emotions such as admiration, sympathy, and trust are reserved only for the in-group and withheld from outgroups. A direct relationship between intense in-group favoritism and out-group antagonism might also be expected in highly segmented societies that are differentiated along a single primary categorization, and this would be especially true if the categorization is dichotomous, dividing the society into two significant subgroups. Such segmentation promotes social comparison and perceptions of conflict of interest that give rise to negative attitudes toward outgroups and high potential for conflict. By contrast, the potential for intergroup conflict may be reduced in societies that are more complex and differentiated along multiple dimensions that are cross-cutting rather than perfectly correlated. However, it is not just the objective reality of overlapping group memberships that will determine whether cross-cutting identities promote tolerance and prevent intergroup conflict. Cross-cutting memberships may have the potential to increase tolerance and give rise to more inclusive, concentric group loyalties, but this potential will not be realized if in-groups are defined exclusively rather than inclusively. Lastly, many studies suggest that Allport was right in assigning psychological primacy to the processes of in-group formation and attachment over attitudes toward outgroups. Many discriminatory perceptions and behaviors are motivated primarily by the desire to promote and maintain positive relationships within the in-group rather than by any direct antagonism toward outgroups. In-group love is not a necessary precursor of outgroup hate. However, the very factors that make in-group attachment and allegiance important to individuals also provide a fertile ground for antagonism and distrust of those outside the in-group boundaries. The need to justify in-group values in the form of moral superiority to others, sensitivity to threat, the anticipation of interdependence under conditions of distrust, social comparison processes, and power politics all conspire to connect in-group identification and loyalty to disdain and overt hostility toward outgroups. Brewer argued that these forces are likely to be particularly powerful in highly segmented societies. Societies characterized by multiple cross-cutting group divisions are more likely to provide a context in which in-group attachments and loyalties are not necessarily associated with out-group antagonisms.